Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, September 14th, 2020, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. I'm actually moving over to a new hosting provider, so if you notice any issues with today's episode, I just recommend rescanning your feeds, meaning just go back through whatever podcast provider that you use, whether it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, all the different places where you can download podcasts, and just rescan your feeds or re-download whatever the process is like for you. That said, if you're listening to me right now, you've probably already done that, or you didn't have to, which would be even better. All right, I'm super excited about this week's show, but before we dive into it, I want to thank those of you who continue to make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, the way that I do my show is that I sell ad space and I have a Patreon account, and that's what helps me keep the show 100% free to download. My model is that anybody who wants to listen to the show should be able to completely free of charge. So it's the patrons, the people who can afford to help support the show, that in a way really offset those fees for everybody else. And I'm super grateful to this amazing community of supporters. I want to give a shout out to my top supporters this week. They include Michael Gaucher, Mary Neva, Christopher Pitts, June Sapara, Pasquale Gelate, Ulrika Hagman, Dudas Infinitas, Charles Payet, Brian Holden, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Robert Christ, and Elise Christie. Thank you all so very much from the bottom of my heart. If you want to support the show, you've just got to visit patreon.com/talknerdy. All right, enough business. Let's talk about this week's show. I was absolutely honored. It was an absolute privilege to be able to sit down with Maya Ajmera. Now, Maya is the president and CEO of the Society for Science and the Public, and the publisher of its incredible magazine, Science News. If you follow me on social media, you know that I'm constantly tweeting, Facebooking, sharing Science News. It's a really important publication that is staffed by, or I should say, that is written by science journalists, not general assignment reporters, but science journalists sharing quality science news. Maya's going to get deep into her history as the founder of the Global Fund for Children, as well as how the Society for Science and the Public is operating and what their mission is, especially in the landscape that we're all facing today. So guys, without any further ado, here she is, Maya Ajmera. Well, Maya, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Cara.
I'm really excited to talk about your work and to talk about, I think, kind of like your present outlook given the context that we're living in right now. So before we dive too deeply into sort of like policy and politics and society, I would love to know exactly how you got where you are. So you're the president and CEO of Society for Science and the Public, and the publisher of the magazine Science News, which I read all the time. I know my listeners that follow me on social media will see that I share articles from Science News all the time. How did you get to that kind of position as somebody who isn't necessarily a scientist?
Well, first of all, Cara, thank you so much for reading Science News and using articles in your work. So, my trajectory is an interesting one, and I don't, hopefully you have a few minutes to hear my story.
Absolutely.
And so there's this famous speech that Steve Jobs gave at Stanford. And there was a line in there saying, you can't connect the dots looking forward, but you can connect the dots looking backwards. And so when I think about myself as president and CEO of the Society for Science and the Public, I connect the dots of where I started, and it makes perfect sense as to where I am today. And so perhaps I'll just start with my story that I'm the daughter of Indian immigrants, born and brought up in Eastern North Carolina. Typical South Asian kid that was going to go on to become a doctor, but took some pivots and turns. The one thing I will say growing up is my father being a physicist, I grew up having science news in our household. But I also started doing science projects when I was in fifth, sixth grade. And I started competing in science fairs. And I was very, very fortunate to work in a botany lab at East Carolina University under an extraordinary professor when I was only 12 years old, under Dr. Prem Sagal. And I
Oh,
started
wow.
studying the growth of duckweed. And duckweed has been thought of as a future source of food because it's high in protein, but it also grows quite rapidly. It grows with, the pods of 2, 4, 8, 16, and so on. And so I studied the growth of duckweeds as a science fair project in sixth, seventh grade. And, using different light, a growth factor being kinetin, and studied that for over a year and presented it at science fairs. And I just fell in love with the scientific process. That experience also just gave me sort of the impetus to keep searching and thinking about science. And so I was very lucky to be in the fourth class of the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics in Durham, North Carolina. NCSSM was founded by Governor Jim Hunt at that time as a high school for juniors and seniors who were gifted in science and math, but wanted to create the next generation of scientists and engineers for the state of North Carolina. And it was public and residential. And so I went there and I kept doing my science research and started working at Duke University and did a science fair project, a science project on recombinant DNA work, and entered that in the Science Talent Search, at that time called the Westinghouse Science Talent Search. And I was very, very fortunate to have been honored as one of the top 300 kids. So I then went on to Bryn Mawr College. I majored in neuroscience. I was going to go on to get an MD, PhD. And Cara, I was very, very fortunate to get a fellowship, and which allowed me to travel from Thailand to Pakistan for a year. And it was during those travels that I had what I call my moment of obligation. It's at a train platform in India. And if you've ever been to India on a train platform, they're pretty chaotic places. But in this one town, I got off on this train platform and I saw 50 kids sitting in a circle learning how to read and write. This teacher, using flashcards, was teaching these kids, and I was mesmerized, and the kids were mesmerized. I asked, "What's going on here?" And she said, "These children live on and around the train platform. They work, they play, they eat, they beg, but they don't go to school." And so a social entrepreneur said she was going to bring the school to the children. And she created a train platform school. And at that time, it cost only $500 to teach 50 kids for 1 year. And it was there that I thought, how do I get small amounts of capital into really innovative grassroots organizations serving the most vulnerable children and youth? And that's where I founded the Global Fund for Children. And so I didn't get my MD, PhD at Duke or wherever I was going to go. I went to Duke to get my master's in public policy and took the right courses of economics and international development and education. And I founded Global Fund and built that over 18 years into a premier international institution, global institution, serving the most vulnerable children and youth.
Wow. Tell me a little bit more about that before we continue on your path. I want to know more about the Global Fund for Children.
So the Global Fund for Children was founded on the premise that I wanted to turn foreign aid upside down on its head. And I wanted it if we as Westerners were going to go into the developing world, we needed to hear from local leaders people embedded in their own communities as to how they were going to create change, especially for the smallest citizens, right? And their families. And, you were starting to see real innovation take place, like the Train Platform School. To me, what was interesting is small amounts of money could do very big change at the grassroots, but also helping them become scalable and sustainable. And so we ended up becoming scouts throughout the world, searchers, and started finding these extraordinary organizations from the Afghan Institute of Learning that founded the homeschools for girls under the Taliban when girls could not be educated. We started funding these secret homeschools in the mid 1990s. We funded some of the first organizations working with AIDS orphans in the continent of Africa. We have funded a group in Cambodia that was working with the children of waste pickers around garbage dumps, not only to give these kids education, but to also provide public health training. And so to me, it was really backing local leaders and local leadership with their ingenuity and providing them the support that they needed.
Right. So instead of kind of the classic NGO model, which we know does not work very well, of sort of going in from the outside, kind of trying to impose a Western perspective and saying, this is what's likely best. It's about going in and saying, what are the people who live here who want to affect change already doing, and how can I empower them?
That's correct. And we believe that's more sustainable, which it is.
Yeah.
So if you go back to all of the groups we've supported, most of them are still operating and are thriving, and many have become national leaders. And that's what you want. You want people in your own community to take those reins, frankly. And we as Westerners need to be able to provide support when as to the needs that they have, and asking versus telling.
Right.
Asking them how can we help versus telling them this is how we should help.
Oh, that's incredible. And so this is something that, you founded in 1993. Is it something that you're still involved in, or have you sort of handed over the reins in an effort to continue on your path?
Yeah, so I'll be honest, I turned 39 and thought I could do this for the rest of my life. But there were two things going on. One was, for me, I always felt that as a founder, you need to give over the reins to the next leadership, because I think that's an important thing to do for ingenuity, for innovation. But the second one, more personal to me, was my husband and I wanted to start a family. And I needed to take a sabbatical, frankly. I had been doing this 24/7, and, biology calls, and the doctor said, you need to take some time to just to contemplate and to think, and so I did, and I went on sabbatical and went to Johns Hopkins University at the School for Advanced International Studies, and I became a visiting scholar. And I wrote a book, started teaching, and I had a baby. My husband and I had a little girl. And then in those 3 years, I got a phone call and from the Society for Science and the Public, and they said they were looking for a new CEO. And I kind of laughed a little bit. I said, well, I haven't done science since college. I was a neuroscience major in college, and I published my last paper my senior year in brain research. But since then, I really haven't done science. They're like, yes, but we think that you should at least put your foot forward to the trustees, because one, you're an alum of the research competitions and science fair. And two, you know how to build an organization. You're entrepreneurial. And three, we need someone to dust off this nearly 100-year-old organization and to create a new vision and thinking around it. And they wanted also someone to come in and also be publisher of Science News, because the other part of my story is I founded a children's book publishing social enterprise with Global Fund for Children. I'm a children's book author. So,
Oh, cool.
yeah. And so I said, okay. And it's an interesting story. I went in for the interview. Russell Reynolds was doing the search, and they asked me to come in for the interview. And it was a very nice room. It was this big circular table, and there was like 7 elderly gentlemen sitting there interviewing me. And my heart dropped a little bit, saying, "Gosh, I'm really not sure if I really have a chance."
Right.
But
Yeah.
but they were really great. They asked me a lot of great questions, and I walked out going, who knows? But I guess the word on the street is that they knew that I was a very strong candidate. I kept getting interviewed, and I was offered the job. And I took the job for a couple of reasons. One was it was very interesting to me to go into an institution that was as old as it was, but had such a strong standing in the education world, and with our magazine, but also needed a new push and a new vision and drive. And I thought that was really an interesting place for me to be. So remember when I said about Steve Jobs, just his speech at Stanford, and is that you can connect the dots looking backwards. Everything that I started from 5th grade to now to being a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins, it all prepared me to be in this moment today, I would say.
Ugh, I love that. And now, of course, you are in an interesting position where, I mean, I guess I'm curious to know what the president and CEO of an organization like the Society for Science and the Public actually does. Like, first of all, what is the sort of mission of the society? And then how do you, as somebody who's sort of leading the cause, I guess, move that mission forward?
So the Society for Science and the Public was founded by E.W. Scripps, the media magnate, 100 years ago. And when he founded the organization, it was founded based on the fact that he was reading in newspapers about three-legged Martians. Like, he was reading incorrect science articles. And he said, we need to create a new cadre of science journalists in this country. And that's how Science News was born in 1921. Fast forward in 1942, the organization began to think about future scientific talent. Like, you're going to create a new cadre of science journalists, but we also need to think about our young people and think about that they're going to be the next innovators, and we need to come and capture them sooner than later. And so in 1942, we founded the Science Talent Search, which was Westinghouse Science Talent Search. In 1950, we founded the Science Fair, okay? The National Science
Wow.
Fair.
Yeah.
Which moved into the International Science and Engineering Fair. And then in 2000, we founded the middle school STEM competition. And for me now, what I do are 3 things. One is making sure. So when I came in, I had some big challenges. Okay, and I'll talk about that. Is that Science News, like all magazines and all newspapers, was bleeding money. To be honest, we were losing millions of dollars, several millions. And I was basically told, I'll never forget this, on maybe my second week on the job, saying, Maya, you either have to find a way to make Science News sustainable, or you're going to have to think about selling it or shutting it down. And my heart stopped. Like, oh my goodness. So we began thinking, like, what can we do to make this sustainable? And I started hearing from teachers and just reading a lot about, one, how old science textbooks were in the classroom, some 10, 15, 20 years old. And 2, that teachers didn't know what to trust on the internet in terms of science. And so I started thinking, why not create a new education program called Science News in high schools and take science news into the high schools every 2 weeks with a teacher guide of teaching science news. We piloted the program, Cara, in 2015 with 250 schools. The demand was so high that we are now in 5,000 high schools across the country, where teachers, we have over nearly 20,000 teachers that use science news in high schools in their classroom. That to me is what turned us around in terms of our sustainability at Science News, okay? Which we're really, really pleased about. We're in such a bullish position now to make sure that Science News is read by everyone. But we're really pleased that the next generation of students is reading Science News. I think with our competitions, we also, on a daily basis, I was brought up with a challenge is that we had a long-term sponsor named, the company called Intel that was our sponsor for many, many years after Westinghouse. And they decided that they didn't want to sponsor the Science Talent Search or the International Science and Engineering Fair. So that was another big challenge, right? That I had to come in and figure out who was going to be the next sponsor. And we actually decided to do something quite interesting. Instead of me putting out my tin cup and going to philanthropists or companies and saying, please be the sponsor, I actually turned it around on its head and said, this is America's jewel, the Science Search. Companies and philanthropists have to apply to us if they want to be want to be the sponsor. And Cara, you would never believe this, but we had 50 philanthropists and companies that indicated incredible interest. We invited RFPs, a proposal, and we got 10 companies to put in proposals. And we had 5 as finalists, and the one that got it was Regeneron. And Regeneron became the 3rd title sponsor in its nearly 75-year history. And what's so beautiful about that is that the 2 founders of Regeneron, Len Schleifer and George Yancopoulos, who's the chief scientific officer, they were Westinghouse Science Talent Search kids.
Oh, I love that.
They competed in Science Talent Search, and George Yancopoulos was one of the winners in his year. So what a virtuous circle, right? And they committed $100 million over 10 years to the Science Talent Search and then swooped in to become the sponsor of the International Science and Engineering Fair.
So that's so great. And that for people who are listening to the show who have been longtime listeners, you guys may remember several months ago when I had Darren Foster and Christina Costatini on the show. They were the directors of Science Fair, the Nat Geo documentary that featured kids competing in ISEF. And also Crystal Dilworth, who you remember is one of my dearest friends. She hosted, a few, I think twice.
Yes.
And so and Science Fair is something I never competed at the national level, but it's something that I competed at the local level when I was in, middle school and high school as well. I think in 8th grade, maybe 9th grade, my partner and I won our regional science fair. And it was like a really big deal. I remember we won $50, which was like so much money back then. And it really, I think in a way, inspired my continued science career because it helped me, again, understand the scientific method a little bit better. It helped show me what kind of competition in the sciences really looks like, but also collaboration within the sciences, which is so important. Science fair is so near and dear to my heart. And I was thrilled to be able to talk to the directors of that film and have them here on the show, because I think it pulled back the curtain a little bit about the experience of kids that are competing in ISEF. Were you involved at all when they made the film? Because you were already in this position, right?
That's right. So it's so interesting. That year, Christina and Darren did Science Fair, but we also had two other filmmakers that did Inventing Tomorrow. So
Oh,
we had two films about ISEF that premiered at Sundance Film Festival.
that's amazing.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, go figure, right? Like,
Yeah.
it rains at court. And just so pleased at the success of both those films. And 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 it's true. I mean, kids they work incredibly hard. They're incredibly ingenious, and they go out there and compete on. And one of the things we take great pride in with ISEF is the fact that nearly 25% of the young people that come in are patent or patent ready. We also take
Wow.
pride in the fact that nearly 50%, 48 to 50% of the competitors are young women.
Hmm.
So, we are really building that next generation of extraordinary talent. And of course, as you see with our title sponsors now, you see that virtuous circle, right, of what
Yeah.
innovation can do and what young people can do. I will also say the other piece of my work that I founded was our outreach and equity work. I feel, and this comes from the whole work of my social justice work with the Global Fund for Children. I came in saying very clearly that we needed to make sure that every young person in this country could become a scientist or engineer if that's what they chose to do. But we needed to give those opportunities. And so we created a slew of outreach and equity programs now reaching hundreds and thousands of young people, which include the Science News in High Schools program, but also a slew of other mentorship program and grant programs, as well as teacher programs. And, that in itself, what we hope builds the pipeline of talent, Cara, that these young people will go on to major in scientific fields or engineering or found companies or become doctors, whatever they want to do, but have a strong sense that they can be a scientist or engineer.
So, it kind of brings up the question for me about how, as somebody in your position, maintains or keeps straight different priorities, especially you have a global perspective. This is something that's so important to you, being of, as you mentioned, South Asian descent, being somebody who has worked in that space for so long, working with providing resources and empowerment to individuals in developing countries. But of course, you're also in this position here in the States. How do you decide where to allocate these resources? In many ways, I think I ask this because in many ways it frustrates me seeing the political public. I don't want to say the general public because I think that's selling us a little bit short. I think I ask because, or I'm interested to understand your perspective because here in the United States, I don't want to say it's a public perspective because I think that sells us a little bit short, but at least under political pressure currently, the climate of, science denial or science questioning is real. And I wonder how frustrating it must be as somebody who really has a hand on science policy to want to help, with science literacy in a society where there's pushback from the highest levels of government.
So, Cara, we as an institution are nonpartisan, so
Hmm.
that's important to say. But I will say this: we we have to continue to do even more, and we have to do more to reach the grassroots, right?
Right.
And one of the things that's been really upsetting for me is how our local newspapers have been decimated through COVID. They were already being decimated. Now with COVID, it's been even worse. How do people get their news? And what do they trust? Right.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
one of the things Science News has been doing is all of our COVID-19 reporting. We have opened that up for free to over nearly 1,000 news outlets across the country. so that they can use those for free and push it into their online sites. And that's been working really well. I think we have to keep working with the young people in this country and making sure. I mean, science has been decimated in our public school systems in many states, Cara.
Yeah.
We have to do more to build STEM education in our public school system. And so that means we have a really important place for local, state, and national government to make sure teachers are being trained, but also that the next generation of young people believe in science and that science is a route for jobs and for building our economy.
All right, everyone, let's get back to the show. Yeah, I mean, I guess, and not to really push on you or put you in an uncomfortable position because, I understand the necessity for a science organization. It's even something that we do in the other podcast that I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, is we maintain an editorial policy that is nonpartisan or, I don't want to say bipartisan. It's actually a nonpartisan stance. But the difficulty comes in, I guess, when you're feeling pushback from any political party, from any individuals or institutions that hold political power, pushback against fundamental scientific principles, right? So, we want to ensure that public education is celebrating science and is, speaking or the curriculum is actually founded in scientific principles, and then you come across pushback from textbook publishers in Texas or from different organizations who don't want science actually represented as it is. And so, how do you, as a public institution, or as the representative really for the Society for Science and the Public, navigate those really, I guess, rocky waters?
So, Cara, it's hard. Don't get me wrong. Again, we go to our programming to push against that. Okay. Do we actually go and we work, we bring in our teachers, our mentors, our young people into the halls of Congress. Okay. And many of these folks are coming from rural parts of this country. Okay. That go in and meet with their congressperson, meet with their senators, and tell them as their constituents, this is what's going on in my district. This is what we need. And that is very powerful to hear from a constituent versus, me going in and I would say, saying what I feel is necessary. What better representation than to hear from a young person coming from a state where science is possibly being decimated and saying, I need this. We need this for our community if we're going to be able to compete. Okay. And I think that's pretty critical. I think the second thing I would say is, our work in itself with Science News, as well as our outreach and equity programming, as well as our affiliated science fair network, is that getting to underserved areas and rural areas in this country is absolutely critical. And I think one of the things that we haven't done a great job about is making sure that not we, but I'm saying as a society, is that inclusion means a lot of different things. And I think we need to do a better job in the idea of inclusion in this country. And that it is about people of color. It is about women, young women. It is about kids who live in rural areas. It is about kids who live in urban areas. It's about inclusion. And that's something that we work really hard at. The pushback is real. The sleepless nights are real. And if you want to know my honest truth, this is a very precarious time in our country. And the fact that there is an anti-science movement building, whether it's against immunizations, whether it's against climate change, whether it is against funding our public school systems with the necessary resources for STEM is highly disturbing. And we've got to make that change. And I can tell
Right.
you personally what I'm doing around that. But look, one of the things we did, even with this administration, is that they had a 5-year STEM plan, science, technology, engineering, and math plan. We pushed hard to make sure that there were several things in that plan that were put in there, including STEM, around science fair, around things that we thought were incredibly important. Did everything get in? No, not at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, I guess maybe moving away from the politics, or at least the shareholders in those politics, and looking more at the constituency and maybe the downstream effects of some of these, propagandas and political anglings. As you said, when it comes to this kind of anti-science movement, which has always existed, like, don't get me wrong, there have always been anti-vaxxers as long as there have been vaccines, and there have always been individuals who question, any sort of, I guess, authoritative view, but it does feel a little bit like today, to the extent that there are literally anti-maskers, like that there are conspiracies have become mainstream to the extent that people think that the pandemic itself is a hoax, and they put not just themselves but their communities at risk by engaging in super risky behavior. Um, you know, we know, I guess, that the deficit model is not the only way to reach individuals. So I guess my question is, when you're sitting in this position as somebody who is not just a publisher, but, has a fair amount of control over messaging from an important society like this, how do you grapple with the idea that it's not just about educating and informing? Like, there's got to be something sort of beyond just giving people the information.
Well, I think that's a good question, Cara. I mean, to me, that the other word that's missing of education informing is inspiring.
Right.
And the inspiration piece is finding individuals like the Caras of the world and the Crystals of the world and other influencers out there that actually can change people's minds. And I think that is absolutely critical that we find more individuals like that, especially young people.
Hmm.
Young people. One of the things I actually really was pleased to hear was Dr. Anthony Fauci speaking to everyone and anyone who would listen, right? And he was being
Right.
interviewed by, I think, Stephen Curry at one point, right, about
Mm.
about COVID-19. And it's like, how do reaching people that of their own constituencies who will be heard is absolutely important. So let's think about churches, for example. And you can organize ministers, right, around
Hmm.
speaking about wearing masks in their sermons, right?
Right.
And you've got to figure out, how do you um, uh, work with a group of ministers or a group of parishioners or whoever in those settings that can mold that behavior, right? And I also believe that social marketing is an important piece of this, right? As much as this, the anti-vaxxers, the anti-mask people, they know how to market. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
They're great marketers. Why are we marketing the total opposite, right? And where are the
Uh-huh.
dollars around that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, and not to get political, but that's often an argument against sort of about the political landscape and progressive policies versus conservative policies too, is that it does seem like a lot of conservative movements just have like better PR people working for them. And that's often really frustrating.
It doesn't matter what political spectrum. I mean, if you want to just be really clear, I think they have been the masters at marketing. They've,
Absolutely.
they've taken the best of private sector principles of marketing a product, marketing an idea, and pushing it out there. And
Yeah.
on the other side, we do not spend those dollars. And that is a real problem on us, frankly.
Which which makes no sense because it's not like, it's not like, let's say, a pro-science movement or a group of individuals who, really advocate for and understand science don't understand social psychology. Like, that's an important part of understanding science. And social psychology is absolutely necessary for understanding persuasion and engagement with the voting public. And yeah, I agree. There have been some real kind of shortcomings on that side as well. It's not just about throwing up our hands and saying, how come people don't understand science? It's like, well, we've got to do more.
We are doing, I think, and I think we have to be a heck of a lot more creative in our messaging
Right.
to counter the messaging that of I'm going to use masks for example of folks not using masks, right? But there's an incredible picture photograph of the 1921 flu, and there's a picture of people standing in line, and there's some people wearing a mask, and there's some that aren't, and it's just so interesting that do these things ever change?
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. During the Spanish influenza, there were anti-maskers and there were, super hardcore pro-maskers. And there was a lot of not just political, but I think legal kerfuffles between the groups. You're right. These things, they crop up and they go away and they crop up and they go away. And I think that the tides can shift and the tides do shift, partially as a function of history unfolding, but partially as a function of people doing the work, which is so important. I guess the real question then, or the real, I don't know, approach then is one that you have been so good at having, which is a big picture, sort of global perspective that says, I'm not going to obsess over the handful of people who are the most entrenched and who have dig their heels in the ground the most. I'm going to reach the people who are open-minded. I'm going to make sure that young people have the tools that they need so that we can see these large tidal shifts as opposed to just obsessing over these like small incremental changes.
I think you're saying that quite eloquently, Cara. I can't say it better. I will say, going back to the Spanish influenza and where we are today, and the whole idea of not wearing masks. I think the thing that's most disappointing is science has just gotten better and more sophisticated, and we're at the cutting edge, and we know so much more.
Right.
Even if we know so much more, that's still not changing people's minds.
If anything, I think sometimes it actually adds to, I think that the reason that we see a large anti-vaxxer movement currently within affluent, sometimes progressive groups, right? We see that one of the biggest anti-vaxxer groups are like young white mothers. And I think that's because of our, it's because science is doing so well. It's because these women have never been exposed to the horrors of polio. And when you don't see the problem in front of you, it's much easier to say, oh, I don't think there is a problem. And so I'm going to change my worldview according to this propaganda. But if we were living in the era of the iron lung, there wasn't a big anti-vax movement during polio because it was just too horrible to think of your kid getting polio.
That's correct. Correct.
And so, I do notice that the sad thing is minds are often changed by tragedy. You sometimes see these very dug in denialists who, when they have a personal experience with something, do have their minds changed. I mean, there are so many testimonial videos online of, somebody saying, oh, I didn't believe this pandemic was real. And I was out there telling people not to wear masks. And then I got sick and now I'm in the hospital, guys. This is real. Please listen and don't make the mistakes that I made. I mean, it's just sad that it does take that kind of tragedy for some people to wake up, because that's not anything any of us wish on anybody.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely correct.
So I guess, I mean, the real question is like, where do we go from here? Is it about just continuing to fight both at a policy level and at an individual educational level? Are you hopeful that we're going to see a sea change, or do you think that these kinds of things really are incremental and we have to sort of take our celebrations as they come, as small as they might be?
I think it's going to take some time, Kara.
Yeah,
I don't think this is going to be even, let's just, regardless of the outcome of the election, let's just say even um, if if Biden were to win, for example, I don't think things will change that quickly. I just
hmm,
don't. I think this has been years in the making. And I think it has to do, I'll be honest with you, I think a lot of it has to do with just how poor our educational system has been over so
right.
many years that now people have grown into adults.
Right,
That,
and you can't just
that
change that
don't
kind of stuff
understand.
overnight. You can't have
No,
sweeping policy reform overnight.
you can't. And so I think it's going to have to be incremental. I think we have to start with young people. I've always been a big believer. You got to start changing the minds of children and above, right? And so when I think about um, the young people right now in elementary school, in school wearing masks or out of school and they're playing in the playground wearing masks, I'm like, okay, many of you get this, right? Even in some rural parts of this country or other parts of this country, wherever. And you certainly see it in the developing world, in places
R
like India and others.
right, you really don't see anti-science,
That
mentalities in children.
right, you do not. You do
Yeah.
not. And something turns somewhere
Mhm.
um, when there's a lack of science being taught at a
Yeah.
certain time. And so we just got to, for us at the Society for Science and the Public as an education organization, we have to keep pushing education in all its many forms. And like I say, I think the place that we have truly failed is in our marketing efforts, And I think we just had to talk about that, right? That
Yeah.
the anti-science movement have been brilliant at the marketing stuff. We have not. We have
Yeah,
sat.
I think there's been a false sense of security that it's such a fundamental part of democracy, or it's such a fundamental part of like, um, I guess like a basic human necessity is education, that we've often taken for granted that it's something that is often fought for, in a lot of parts of the world. As you mentioned before, girls in Afghanistan fighting for education, girls in other parts of more like oppressive regimes fighting for education. I think here in the United States, we've gotten a little bit comfortable with the idea that, like, of course, kids should be educated. That's non-political. And really, when you start to look into the nitty gritty, the way somebody is educated has very political outcomes.
Absolutely. Start
It's like,
taking the peels of the onion off of the
right.
education in this country, and you can go from one school to another school and have a very different experience. Right?
Hmm.
You can go to the state of Texas and be learning something very different than from the state of Minnesota or the state of New York.
Right.
Okay.
And you can go to Chicago and, look at what's being taught in the inner city versus in the suburbs and say, wow, these kids are getting a very different education as well, just based on their socioeconomic status, just based on the color of their skin. And that's a failure.
It's a big failure, and it's not a level playing field at all. And that's where I get passionate about, right?
Right.
And then you start hitting the private schools
Hmm.
with the public schools, and so there's a bifurcation of the public school system, and then you think about the private school on top of that. And then I do think that we take education and our rights for granted. You go to
Absolutely.
different parts of the world where I have been to some very dark places, and there are families and communities that will do anything for an education for their children, right?
Hmm.
You will find, like I said, a train platform, a school on a train platform. and seeing 50 kids who are so poor, but are so engrossed in learning how to read and write. Okay. That is a sort of, mindset for me of the discrepancies and in this world. Right. And, we just, as at the Society for Science and the Public, we just have to do a better job. I will say very honestly, and it's something we're working very hard at, is marketing the heck out of ourselves.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I sometimes think of like coming at this from an existential perspective because that's where my education is right now. I'm working on my PhD in existential clinical psychology. And so I have this real interest in the idea of extremes and polarities. And, I feel very strongly, this is a meandering way for me to say this, but I feel very strongly that mortality is important for existence, right? And so like understanding that we will one day die helps us live life to the fullest, and brushes with death, loss of loved ones is what really helps us imbue our lives with meaning. And I think that sometimes the way the world ebbs and flows in the biggest picture is that affluent communities lose perspective, and they have to be not intentionally, but passively, things happen where you're shaken to your core and you realize your gratitude. You're reminded of what you have to lose. And I think, just like you said, we've taken education for granted for so long because we've been such a wealthy, thriving country on the whole. Obviously there's great disparity with this country, that when as a society we have those core values threatened, whether it be by a pandemic, whether it be for political purposes, or because of poverty, or all of these reasons, it wakes us up a little bit, or at least that's the hope, right? That we can really affect change because we're reminded how tenuous, how capricious this really is. It's not something we should be taking for granted at all.
I mean, I think we have learned out of this how fragility,
Yes.
right? It's fragility. It's just how fragile we all are. And I think for us, it's just that we've been a country that's always been prepared,
Mm-hmm.
and how unprepared we were for this.
Right. And I mean, I think that that's something, kind of maybe the last thing, if you're comfortable with it, that I'd love to touch on with you, because of course you're in this very interesting job during a very, very interesting time. And of course, as we all know, any of us who follow science news, not just Science News, the publication, but all of science news in general, we know that coronavirus, COVID-19, absolutely dominates the headlines. My feed reader is probably 90% COVID articles all the time. And obviously, it's everything and everywhere because it's the life that we're living. It's keeping us locked in our homes. It's, preventing us from experiencing life the way that we once did. It's our new normal for the time being. And so, how has it affected your mission and what it is that you're doing at the Society for Science and the Public and at Science News? And B, kind of what is I would love to know your personal perspective on how we're faring right now, what the future really looks like.
So let me take the first one of how we pivoted. So this really interesting story. In late February, we were planning to bring the 40 finalists of the Regeneron Science Talent Search in early March. And our newsroom at Science News had already been reporting about COVID, right?
Mm-hmm. Because of Wuhan.
In early January about
right.
Wuhan, China. It became very clear to me that I needed to make a very big decision, right, about whether we postpone the 40 finalists coming to Washington, D.C., and worked with Regeneron, had made an executive decision that we were postponing it, to sort of the chagrin to some folks thinking I was being total, overreacting. Well, lo and behold, literally 2 weeks later, everything shut down, and we were smack in the middle of the finalist week. I still wake up with nightmares of a story in the New York Times saying 40 finalists of the Regeneron Science Talent Search were super spreaders.
Right. Yeah. That wouldn't be
It
good.
wasn't Biogen in Boston. It was actually the Society for Science and the Public. Lo and behold, that didn't happen. But what did happen for us was that we pivoted really hard, and we decided to go virtual with our competition. So with the International Science and Engineering Fair, we did not have the competition, but we created a 5-day intense programming with nearly 80 speakers, Nobel Prize winners, to Brian Greene, the physicist, to Vince Cerf, Google evangelist, and had 5 days of this intense virtual programming, and had nearly 20,000 people come to the virtual festival for science for young people from over 110 countries.
Oh, amazing.
That was in May. And then we did the virtual competition for the Regeneron Science Talent Search in July. So they actually, the 40 kids competed virtually. So we had our judges judge them virtually. And to make it all equitable, we rented laptops, the same laptop for every kid and every judge. They all had the same backdrops. They had to wear the same shirt. It was all in equity and in fairness. And we're about to do our middle school STEM competition, the Broadcom Masters, in the same way in October. So we have really pivoted. And with Science News, our newsroom just has completely turned. And, not only are we reporting on all other extraordinary science discoveries happening, but we have been incredibly on the front, cutting edge of COVID-19 reporting, and making sure that those articles are there for free for local newsrooms. Now, the last part of where do I see us going? Was that the last question?
Yeah, I mean, you're in a really premier position because as a publisher of, this publication that it has its finger on the pulse of what's happening with COVID. You're seeing the research as it's coming out. You're aware of the big picture of how COVID is really affecting society as a whole. So, in a way, you have this more cosmic or this more global perspective as you're seeing everything unfold.
So can I give an example of something quickly? So I don't know if you remember the story that went viral about how, the masks that are gaiters. Do you remember that?
Yes. And everybody was like, oh yeah, net gaiters are worse than masks. That was what the kind of top line that everybody was passing around, which is not what the study said.
No, it's not what the study said. So literally when that article first came out, unfortunately in the Washington Post, our newsroom pivoted literally in an hour to put out a major story that is not what the study said from Duke. And wrote that story and went out and it spread like wildfire as well. But that first story went out there, which was not correct. And so we take great pride in the fact at Science News that we're reporting on evidence-based work, okay? And written by science journalists. And so that is extremely important. If I were to say what the future holds, we've got to look really carefully, and our newsroom is doing this 24/7. What are these vaccines going to be, right? And the outcomes.
And how will they be affected by politicization? That's the thing that's scariest to me is like, if a vaccine is ready by early November, I am going to be very skeptical.
Right. And I think most of the scientific evidence-based folks are right about this, who report on this, actually feel the same way. But vaccines becoming politicized is going to be very scary, because there will also be very smart people who will be very scared to take a vaccine, even if it is legitimate. Right.
And then that has a really bad backfire effect for the anti-vaxxers. Like it emboldens them. Yeah.
So that is my big fear for the next 2 to 6 months, frankly. And I think my other biggest anxiety right now is the apocalyptic nature of nature, frankly, of,
Yeah.
of just our world exploding. When you look at the wildfires in California or throughout the West and what you saw in Australia last year, I am very worried about the environment and climate change. And, you know, and those two coupling with each other is extremely, it's stressful.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so I don't want to leave on a low note. um, I want to leave on a note to say that at the work at the Society for Science and the Public, I think what gets me out of bed every day, what gets my whole team out of bed every day, is the extraordinary ingenuity and innovation taking place with young people and young scientists and engineers across this country and around the world who are working around the clock to help solve some of these intractable problems we're facing right now.
Hmm.
And I just think we have to make all bets on this, and we have to continue investing and making bets on young people and scientists and engineers, because if we don't, I think we're in big trouble.
Hear, hear. I usually close my episodes by asking my guests the same two questions. I feel like you just answered them kind of before I asked. I ask, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night and worries you? And then on the flip side, what are you, really genuinely hopeful for? And I feel like you just encapsulated that kind of to a T. If there's anything you wanted to add to that, I wanted to give you the space to do it. But if you feel like you just answered those questions, that's good too.
I think I answered them. I would say, Kara, that I have, along with science and believing in the importance of science and what our scientists are doing in this day, I also want to just say, I think you used the word gratitude.
Hmm.
Feeling enormous amount of gratitude for our doctors and our nurses and the people who are at the grocery stores and who are delivering packages, who are our frontline workers. I'm filled with enormous amount of gratitude.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. And I think that it's something that we really do have to stop and think about on a more regular basis. We're lucky enough to think about it or to be reminded when we find ourselves in a position where we need groceries delivered or where we need to, run over to the corner store. But we don't see these people every day. Many of us haven't experienced the healthcare system at all during this crisis. And so we're not exposed to the, like you said, frontline healthcare workers that are risking their lives every day to save other lives. And, stopping and thinking about that, it really does give you a whole lot of
It gives you
perspective.
a huge
Yeah.
perspective. And so, I will end with gratitude, but also the belief in innovation and the belief in the idea that human beings innovate, and we innovate in a time of adversity. And
Mm.
we're going to see some extraordinary things happen in the next year, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years now
Yeah.
because of this.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, Maya, let everybody who's listening right now know how they can learn more about the society, how they can learn more about science news, if they want to get involved, if they want to give time or they want to support the organization financially. Where can you direct them?
So the best way is to go to our website, which is www.societyforscience.org. And it would encourage all your listeners to become members of the society, but to also become subscribers of Science News. And you can read that at sciencenews.org.
Awesome. Well, Maya, thank you so much for taking the time today. I learned a lot. I'm honestly inspired. Sometimes these kinds of conversations, what you're going to talk about a little bit, that you're going to get into some hairy stuff that can really be draining. But honestly, I'm hopeful. I'm really hopeful. And it's because of people like you and the work that you do, the tireless work to really push for a better future for all of us. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you so much, Cara. It's been an honor to be with you this afternoon. Thanks.
Of course. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.